Young girls were hunted and turned into sex slaves. 10 victims would die before investigators captured the serial killer couple behind that crime spree.
I swear to Almighty God, I never killed any of them.
Look at Henry. He's pleasant, he's non-threatening, and actually a killing machine.
The application of such current must be continued until you are dead. The warden, the time of notice of appeal will be filed on your behalf.
There's something particularly chilling about couples who kill together. I'm about to walk you through some of America's most notorious killer couples. These aren't fictional characters from some late-night crime drama. These are real people who committed unspeakable acts and are now paying the ultimate price.
You've just been sentenced to death twice. Don't you have anything to say?
Behind the cold concrete walls of America's most secure prisons. Raymond and Faye Copeland. You might think that by the time folks reach their 70s, they're past the age of violent crime. You'd be dead wrong. Raymond Copeland, age 76, and his wife Faye, age 69, became the oldest couple ever sentenced to death in the United States. Operating their farm in Missouri, this elderly pair developed a bone-chilling scheme in the late 1980s. They hired drifters and homeless men to work on their property, had them purchase cattle with bad checks, then murdered them when they were no longer useful. The twisted part? Faye Copeland turned their victims' clothing into quilts, while Raymond handled the killing. Investigators discovered a guest bedroom with a quilt made from the dead men's clothing. Talk about sleeping under a blanket of evil. When authorities searched their property, they found the bodies of 5 men buried on the farm. The smoking gun was a list of workers' names with X's marked next to those who had been killed. Raymond died of natural causes while on death row in 1993. Faye's sentence was eventually commuted to life imprisonment due to her developing dementia, and she passed away in 2003. Their case shocked America not just because of its brutality, but because it shattered the notion that advanced age brings wisdom and compassion. Alton Coleman and Debra Brown.
The whereabouts of fugitive Alton Coleman and companion Debra Brown are still a mystery today. And until police think otherwise, they're assuming he remains in the Dayton-Cincinnati area.
Summer of 1984. The Midwest was terrorized by a couple on a killing spree that crossed 6 states in just 53 days. Alton Coleman and his accomplice Debra Brown left a trail of blood from Illinois to Michigan, Ohio to Indiana. Coleman, with his charismatic personality, and Brown, described by psychiatrists as having a mental dependency on him, murdered 8 people during their rampage. Their victims ranged from a 7-year-old girl to a 77-year-old man. The brutality of their crimes, strangulation, beating, and sexual assault, left veteran investigators shaken. What's particularly disturbing is how they gained their victims' trust. They'd approach families, children, and elderly individuals with a smile and a request for directions or assistance. Once they had their foot in the door, literally and figuratively, the nightmare began. When finally captured in Evanston, Illinois, the couple faced numerous trials across multiple states. Coleman received 4 death sentences.
You've just been sentenced to death twice. Don't you have anything to say?
Brown, despite psychiatrists testifying about her dependent personality disorder and borderline intellectual functioning, received death sentences in Indiana and life terms in Ohio. Coleman was executed by lethal injection in 2002. Brown's Indiana death sentence was later commuted to life imprisonment, and she continues to serve multiple life sentences in Ohio. To this day, she has never expressed remorse, maintaining that her devotion to Coleman justified everything they did. Gerald and Charlene Gallego. Now let me tell you about a couple whose depravity knew no bounds. Gerald Gallego and his wife Charlene terrorized California and Nevada between 1978 and 1980. Get this. Gerald convinced Charlene that he needed sex slaves to fulfill his twisted fantasies. Together, they abducted 10 victims, mostly teenage girls and young couples. Their method was frighteningly simple. Charlene would approach potential victims in malls or at gatherings, gain their trust, and lure them to their vehicle where Gerald waited. The victims were then taken to remote locations where the girls were sexually abused by Gerald, sometimes for days, before both victims were murdered, usually by Gerald with a hammer or gunshot to the head. The couple's rule was no witnesses left alive. Their reign of terror ended when Charlene's friend recognized details about a missing couple in a newspaper report and connected them to suspicious comments Charlene had made. In a classic case of turning on each other, Charlene agreed to testify against Gerald in exchange for a reduced sentence. Gerald received the death penalty in both California and Nevada, while Charlene got 16 years and 8 months. Gerald died of rectal cancer while on death row in 2002. Charlene, after serving her sentence, changed her name and disappeared into obscurity. The case became infamous, not just for its brutality, but for the psychological dynamics between the couple, a sexually sadistic man and a partner willing to procure victims to maintain his affection. Henry Lee Lucas and Ottis Toole.
I killed nobody, no. Okay. I ain't killed a soul in Colorado.
You've probably heard of Henry Lee Lucas, the man who once claimed to have killed hundreds of people across America. While many of those confessions were later debunked, what's certain is that Lucas and his partner in crime, Ottis Toole, committed multiple murders while drifting across the country in the 1970s and early 80s. Their partnership was built on shared childhood traumas and violent tendencies. Lucas and Toole met at a soup kitchen in Florida and formed an immediate bond that would evolve into one of America's most infamous killing partnerships. They even became involved with Toole's niece, Becky Powell, creating a disturbing family unit that traveled together until Lucas killed Powell in a jealous rage. These two didn't have a sophisticated modus operandi. They picked up hitchhikers, approached strangers at truck stops, or broke into homes. The killings were often spontaneous and extraordinarily brutal, involving torture, mutilation, and even cannibalism, in some cases Toole admitted to. Lucas received the death penalty in Texas, later commuted to life imprisonment after doubts emerged about some of his confessions. He died of heart failure in prison in 2001. Toole received life sentences and died of cirrhosis in 1996. What makes their case particularly notable is how it exposed flaws in the criminal justice system. Police departments across the country closed hundreds of cases based on Lucas's confessions. Confessions he later said were made to get better prison conditions and attention. The full extent of their actual crimes may never be known. Charles Starkweather and Caril Ann Fugate. January 1958. A 19-year-old garbage collector named Charles Starkweather and his 14-year-old girlfriend Caril Ann Fugate embarked on what would become one of America's most notorious killing sprees. It began with the murder of Fugate's family, her mother, stepfather, and 2-year-old half-sister in their home in Lincoln, Nebraska. For almost a week afterward, the couple lived in the house with the dead bodies, turning away visitors with a note claiming the family was ill. When they finally fled, they went on a rampage across Nebraska and into Wyoming, killing 7 more people over the next 8 days. Their victims included a wealthy industrialist and his wife, their maid, a farmer, a teenager, and a shoe salesman and his girlfriend. The nation was gripped by fear as news of the teenage killers spread. When they were finally captured after a high-speed chase in Wyoming, the case became a media sensation. Starkweather's trial was swift. Despite attempts to plead insanity, he was sentenced to death and executed by electric chair in 1959. Fugate maintained she was an unwilling hostage throughout the ordeal, but the jury didn't buy it. She was sentenced to life imprisonment. After serving 17 years, Fugate was paroled in 1976. She has since lived a quiet life under a new name, still maintaining her innocence. The case inspired numerous books, songs, and films, including the classic Badlands and parts of Natural Born Killers. Their story continues to fascinate because it epitomizes the darkest potential of teenage rebellion, a Bonnie and Clyde for the post-war generation that shattered America's idealized view of its youth. Ian Brady and Myra Hindley.
Myra Hindley, probably the most hated woman in Britain, is dead. The Moors murderess died of a chest infection after 36 years in jail.
Although they weren't imprisoned in the U.S., no discussion of killer couples would be complete without mentioning Brady and Hindley. Between 1963 and 1965, this British couple abducted, sexually assaulted, and murdered at least 5 children between the ages of 10 and 17 in the Manchester area. What made their crimes particularly horrific was that they recorded the torture of their victims on audio tape and took photographs of their burial sites on Saddleworth Moor, souvenirs to relive their crimes. Brady, a bookbinder with an interest in Nazi literature and the works of the Marquis de Sade, found in Hindley a willing accomplice who would do anything to please him. Together they committed what the British press called the most evil crimes in British history. Both received life sentences. Brady died in 2017 after spending more than 5 decades behind bars, most of it in a psychiatric hospital. Hindley died in prison in 2002. To this day, the name Moors Murderers sends shivers down the spine of anyone familiar with the case. James Gregory Marlowe and Cynthia Kaufman. In 1986, this couple embarked on a crime spree that left 4 women dead across California and Arizona. Marlowe, a white supremacist with Helter Skelter tattooed on his arm, and Kaufman targeted women for robbery, but their crimes quickly escalated to murder. Their pattern was consistent. They would abduct women from shopping malls or their homes, force them to withdraw money from ATMs, then strangle them after subjecting them to sexual abuse. The victims were then buried in shallow graves in the desert. What's particularly chilling about this case is Kaufman's transformation. Before meeting Marlowe, she had no criminal history. Friends described her as kind and gentle. After falling under his influence, she participated enthusiastically in the murders, even initiating the abduction of one victim. During their trial, they turned on each other, a common theme with killer couples when facing justice. Both were convicted and sentenced to death in California. They remain on death row today, their case slowly moving through the appeals process. Kaufman holds the distinction of being the first woman sentenced to death in California since capital punishment was reinstated in 1978. Their case is often cited in studies of domestic abuse and coercive control, with debate continuing about whether Kaufman was a victim of Marlowe's influence or a willing participant equally responsible for their crimes. Fred and Rosemary West. Again, not U.S.-based, but internationally notorious, the Wests murdered at least 12 young women between 1967 and 1987, including 2 of their own children. Their home at 25 Cromwell Street in Gloucester, England, became known as the House of Horrors. Fred, a construction worker, and Rose, who worked as a prostitute from their home, would lure young women with offers of employment, shelter, or relationships. The victims were then imprisoned, tortured, and sexually abused before being murdered and dismembered. Their remains were buried in the cellar, garden, or under the floorboards of the West home. What makes this case particularly disturbing is the facade of normalcy the couple maintained. They raised several children in the same house where they buried their victims. Those children later reported enduring sexual and physical abuse themselves. The crimes only came to light when Fred began sexually abusing his daughter, who confided in a friend. When police began investigating, Fred attempted to cover up by excavating some of the remains himself. Fred committed suicide in his prison cell while awaiting trial in 1995. Rose was convicted of 10 murders and sentenced to life imprisonment with a recommendation that she never be released. She continues to maintain her innocence despite overwhelming evidence. So what drives two people to kill together? Experts point to a phenomenon called folie à deux, a madness shared by two. Usually one partner is dominant and has psychopathic or sadistic tendencies, while the other is submissive and desperate for approval. Dr. Al Carlisle, a prison psychologist who evaluated numerous murderers, described it this way. The dominant partner creates a kind of closed psychological world, and the submissive partner abandons their own moral framework to adopt the distorted reality of their lover. This doesn't mean the submissive partner isn't responsible